Hello friends, this is Govin here with GovinKilgore.com. This topic, for some people, is very controversial. I feel like I give that preface for every video I do on this channel now, but it's a little more necessary for this one. It can be misconstrued as something that was associated with eugenics in the past, and I'm not associating it with that at this point, and I think there's a more depth within this that we can glean from it and use to improve our own lives and understand our own history and background and cultural traditions. But just to give some background reference to this, what it was in the past and where it's moving out of, we're going to be talking about the European subraces. And what I mean by that is defining groups of people by certain character and cultural traits, physiological traits, height, appearance, facial appearance, and things like that. And even to some extent, there's going to be personality traits associated with this. And in the past, there was a breakdown of 3 major subgroups, possibly even 4 if we go beyond the beginning stages of when they were making these definitive qualifications for these different groups. And in modern times, I think we have enough historical evidence, at least more of it, archaeological and whatnot, as well as genetic evidence and research, that we can divide this into 6 major groups and lose a lot of the baggage that was associated with this in the past, with the eugenics movements within Europe as well as within the US. Now, a lot of this began with a book by a amateur eugenicist slash anthropologist who was a lawyer named Madison Grant, and he wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race. Quite a title. And the reason it was a controversial book, or is seen as that now, is because it was considered Hitler's Bible. Now, if we can please set that association aside, we can use this information from the past to see what was beneficial about it. Some people just immediately reject everything, and that's sort of where we're at today with people saying race doesn't exist. Well, race does exist, but also sub-races exist. And there's phenotypes and character traits and physiological traits that exist within these different groups. I think there was a lot of bias within those traditional ways that they group people, and I'm advocating for a modern sort of 6 labels, which I'll get to in not too long, that go further back in time, and thus we get past all that more modern history baggage when you consider like one group oppressing the other, and ideas of inferiority kind of come out of one group being oppressed, and thus they can't develop as much, or they fall into poverty, and so because they don't express as much development in a technological sense, they're seen as inferior, which in my opinion isn't fair in characterizing them. So let's first talk about the first 3 or 4 groups that they created, and then I'll talk about the 6 and the differences between those groupings. So you had the Nordic race, obviously that's pretty self-explanatory. You had the Alpines and you had the Mediterraneans. The Alpines were throughout Central and a bit of Western Europe, and they were groups of people that were said to have evolved more among mountainous areas, so they were shorter, but they had similar looks to the Nordics in some senses. They had some overlap. You know, they had various groupings of hair color, eye color that was most preponderant within the different groups as well. And then the 4th group, which wasn't actually covered in that book, but was talked about at the time, with the Dinaric race, which again kind of fell around the Eastern European area. And there's a lot of overlap between Alpine and Dinaric in some areas. There's a lot of overlap between Nordic and Alpine in some areas. And then also you had along the borders with the Mediterranean groups, you had a lot of overlap there as well. Now, what I propose as the more modern view of these subgroups is more favorable in my view because it acknowledges further back in history. So if you think of the history of Europe, you have 45 to 50,000 years. The whole bias that is associated with these old labels is looking at the different groups in a purely modern sense of where they're located and how they appear and their character traits that exist regardless of what environmental influences might be going on politically around those groups. So all of that is post-agricultural as well, whereas these 6 labels I'm going to talk about are rooted in pre-agriculture, in tribal European society. And I've talked a lot about this concept on my new channel, which I'll link to below, which I get into the more spiritual aspects of some of these topics. I talk mostly about my own heritage and those European practices and traditions, so that'll be more Teutonic and Celtic. But to first go over the 6 labels, you have the Teutons, or Teutonic peoples, you have the Celts, you have the Hellenic peoples, you have the Slavic peoples, the Baltics, and finally the Uralic people. Now, each of these groups, if you don't already know something about those names and their history, to go over them, the Teutonic is basically the Germanic tribes or the Nordic race, using the old terminology, and there's not a lot of difference between what the old label talked about and this one. The word Teutonic comes from Tyr, or Tew, and that's the same origin for the word Tuesday, which was the god of war within the heathen traditions. And that is probably why there's this association with military, with Germany and all these other Nordic race areas. You know, there is the personality trait of being very efficient and organized, kind of in a military sense. Thus, the Teutonic label fits quite well. Now, to go over some of their other traits, they, of all the groups within the world, but also within Europe, have the highest preponderance of blonde hair or red hair, also blue and green eyes. They were also some of the last Europeans, especially within the Nordic countries, meaning Scandinavian countries, to become agrarian. So they were hunter-gatherers in very recent history, so they have this taller stature, which actually they have lost since the time of the Vikings. There used to be a bigger difference between the height of men and women within Scandinavian countries, and they've actually lost some of that stature up to recently. But because of that, that's why the Vikings were so formidable, because they were still partly hunter-gatherers, so they had this big frame, and they were able to dominate the more southern European cultures because they were further along in the agrarian periods, where they lost a lot of the bone density and size and genetic fortitude that comes from a wild lifestyle. So the second group I mentioned was the Celts, and there's not a lot of Celts left within Europe. They're the origins of the first people that came into Europe, the first Cro-Magnon peoples, and they encountered Neanderthals first, so they have the highest percentage of Neanderthal DNA mixed in with them usually. And at one point, all the tribes within Europe were considered Celtic, and then other groups started to come in. But they got pushed to Western Europe, and then they got pushed all the way onto the United Kingdom, and then a little bit left in the Basque region of France, and then a few other areas. There's little pockets further into Europe as well, but the highest percentage of, I guess, total Celtic societies exist in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, a couple pockets within England itself, and then also the Isle of Man, some of the islands off of France, and then of course the Basque region, which overlaps a little bit with France but is mostly in Spain. And all of those groups are the most genetically similar to each other. The Basques are actually very different from even the Celts, but out of anywhere in the world that they're closest to, they're fairly close to the Celts. The highest preponderance of O-negative blood exists within Celts, and so that gives the theory that maybe the Neanderthals had O-negative blood, and that's where that first negative blood came from. And of course you had A, B, and AB blood, which may have gotten the rhesus negative blood from interacting with either the Celts or the Neanderthals themselves. Now, one major difference between the old definitions that were created in the early part of last century and the modern understanding of the Celts is that they were calling them part of the Mediterranean race. But that's not true. The Mediterraneans, meaning the Hellenics, were very separate, different language origin, different cultural practices, and the Celts were closer related to the Teutonic groups. There might have been a fair amount of overlap far in the past. And a lot of instances in archaeology, as far as I've read, where they're digging up really old tribal artifacts going back to far beyond pre-Christianity, especially on mainland Europe. The archaeologists have a hard time determining whether what they're digging up is Celtic or Teutonic. The things that end up giving away are when there's any written language. There's obviously big differences there, but there isn't that much of a difference between the deities and the spiritual traditions and the actual appearance of the artifacts. They had very similar swords, very similar armor, and very similar lifestyles all around. Now, there was certainly blonde hair, red hair, blue eyes, green eyes within the Celts as well, but not as high a percentage as in the Teutons. And then on to the third group, the Hellenics. This was given the label of the Mediterraneans in the past with these old labels. And this is where you see the Romans, the Greeks, and even all the old tribal groups that came before them. So other terms for this is the Latin race or Latin subrace. And that's not referring to what's now today called Latin America, but it's talking about, again, that band of areas from Italy to Spain and Portugal, essentially, as well as Greece and the most southern part of France. But these groups don't exist purely in the countries that we see in modern day. There's a lot of other tribal groups from other of these labels within these pockets. So you had the Visigoths in Spain and Portugal at various points that are mixed in with the modern Spaniard people and Portuguese. Those were Teutonic tribes and had the qualities and characteristics of the Teutons. You had the Franks in France, so the further north in France you get, the more Teutonic traits you find, and that's because the Frankish tribes were Nordic as well as the area of Normandy. But at the very most southern point of France, you see more of the Mediterranean characteristics. Within Greece, the Spartans were rumored to have been more Nordic. There was a lot of written accounts of them having a greater percentage of their people as being blonde-haired and lighter-eyed. Then in Italy, in the more northern parts of Italy, you had the Lombards that came down at various points in history, especially when Rome was falling. And so in modern Italy, again, you're going to have a combination of different groups that people have ancestry connected to. To keep going on, you have the Slavic subrace. That's a very broad area, and there's a lot of different tribal practices that occurred in those areas. And you could probably break that down maybe even to several groups. The fifth one I mentioned, the Baltics, sometimes they're lumped in with the Slavs, although there is enough differences that we could call them their own group, even though they're probably the smallest of all these different groups we're talking about. But the Slavic traditions are unique. They had a high rate of blonde-haired and lighter eyes as well. And if you look at the spiritual traditions and deities that they worshipped and the practices, there's very strong similarities between the Teutonic peoples as well as the Celtic peoples. So one way I describe it as when you had people coming up into Europe and sort of spreading out into it, at one point you had groups that broke off and stayed together and later broke off and became 6 labels I'm talking about here. And so because of that, there's more recent similarities in history to their traditions, to their language. Obviously, we can't just define these things purely by language, because you had Teutonic tribes that would move into, say, France. When you had the Normans that would settle there, they were strongly Teutonic, but they adopted French. They adopted Christianity. So that didn't change their genetic structure, but it changed their culture. And then over in England, you had a combination of Celts and Anglo-Saxons, which were Teutonic, as well as some Vikings and Normans mixed in. So English is a combination of mostly an old German language combined with some French and a little bit of Latin influence for the language that a lot of people use today who may not even have any background connected to those ancestral groups. So if we keep going along, the Baltics, that's a very small area of Lithuania, Latvia, parts of Estonia, whereas in Estonia you actually have a lot of influence of the Urals as well. But in terms of their genetics, those areas are all very similar. They're kind of an in-between point between the Teutonic peoples and the Slavs in that area. There is some overlap of Teutonic peoples and Slavs further south. So you kind of have that point where Poland is one of those in-between areas and the countries that kind of come down there. Whereas on the north side of Estonia, you have the Uralic peoples, and then you go up into Finland, and you have the Sami and the Finnish, and some other tribal groups which also had their overlap with the Teutonic peoples coming down into Sweden and Norway in modern country terms. Now the Uralic groups were quite different in that they came up and over, and they had a lot more of those Asiatic features, had a more Asiatic language, and that is probably the most genetically unique group within Europe, although maybe the Basque would have that. But there's actually a couple outliers, which would be those two groups as well as Iceland and maybe some other small islands and things. So what do we actually get from this? Well, unless you're actually actively engaging in any kind of community that is either practicing or looking into these things, you might think, well, what's the point of all this? Well, it's purely for interest, but you can also understand yourself and your own features. It's really useful, I think, just in terms of relating to other people. I was talking to someone just the other day, and I'd been really looking into phenotypes and these European sort of sub-race type concepts, and I asked them their genetic origin or their background, and without them even giving me a response, I just said, "You're Ukrainian, aren't you?" And they looked at me shocked because no one had ever guessed that. They were, I think, only a quarter Ukrainian, and then 3/4 of them was Irish and British and things like that. But that 1/4 was very prominent in their features, and because I guess I've been looking at this, I could figure that out. For me personally, whenever I talk about that with someone and they guess my background, actually this person then guessed me, and they guessed I was Russian. And literally just a few days before that, someone said, "You look Serbian." I've had people say I look Italian. French is a really common one. Heard Spanish. On the rare occasion, I might even get Middle Eastern. But I'm none of those things. As far as I knew before I had genetic testing done, I knew I was purely from the UK pretty much. English, Scottish, a little bit of Welsh, a little bit of Irish. And once I had this 23andMe testing done, I had confirmation going further back that, it is pretty much exclusively Northwestern European, 99% or whatever. So a lot of people simply go by hair color and eye color when they're trying to determine someone's background. But you have to look at face shape, vague features in different ways, their stature, all these different things make up phenotypes, and phenotypes fit within these 6 sub-races that I've sort of classified here. So some ways you might find this of benefit in your personal life, being aware of these things, is not just in terms of perceiving people and perhaps categorizing them in your mind. There's actually not really a benefit to that. It's just one way of perceiving the world with more depth, I guess. But is to actually bring in more people into your life who are more kin to you. So kin meaning sort of the groupings of people that are beyond genetic family or blood family, but are still our blood in the extended sense beyond family. By surrounding yourself with people like that, you may find that you have a better feeling around your life. I'm not saying those who choose to surround themselves with very diverse people don't have good lives, and I'm not saying that you can't have wonderful interactions with people who are very different from you. When I personally reflect on my history and the biggest clashes I've had with people, they tended to not be very similar to me in their background. They might have been all, in terms of the people I'm immediately thinking of, they might have all been Europeans because I've grown up in a very white area of the world, but they weren't similar backgrounds of Europeans to me. Perhaps one factor in that was that they weren't as close ancestrally as my own background is. When I think of the people I've been closest to over the years that have kept the best connection to me, they've had very similar backgrounds to me, to the point where we probably have family back far enough that intermixed at some point, so we could be very distantly related. Now, I'm not advocating taking this to any extremes. I'm just simply saying pay attention to it, and if it's something that you're drawn to, cultivate more people to be around you that are more similar to you, whether you take it to the point of whom you choose as a partner for life, or if it's simply a couple friends, or you could take it to the point of joining some kind of group. There's, I guess, a renaissance of return to sort of tribal ideas in terms of having a community that is genetically similar like that. Some people do it purely on the spiritual level, where they're going to their spiritual roots and ethnicity doesn't matter, or actual genetic heritage. But there are certainly a lot of groups that are emerging that do identify with the genetic aspect of that. You see this initially within groups who become decimated and broken apart. There was a revival after the 60s. In the 70s and 80s, I believe, is when it really picked up, of the indigenous peoples of the Americas reclaiming their roots, and that's allowed them to progress and get back a lot of their culture and heritage and improve their own livelihoods in the face of, a dominant culture that was basically trying to wipe out their culture through subterfuge with those of them that had been left on reservations and things like that. I think that's wonderful that they've done that. I don't think you have to be oppressed to that extent as an individual, as a people, to cultivate that as well, because there's a lot of strength and community and support that comes from surrounding yourself with your kin. And if you really resonate with this and you're young and you don't have a life partner, consider being conscientious and making that a factor within whom you choose as a life partner. Because if you're going to have kids and you want your kids to look like you, that's an argument brought up by people that look at interracial relationships versus not. But you can take it further and go into sub-races and say, okay, well, this is my background. I might be a mix. I might not be such a big mix, but I want my kids to have that same background. So I'm going to look for someone as a partner who has a majority background that's similar to the majority of mine. You obviously don't want to be related. I'm not talking about that extent. That's going way to the other extreme, and no one in their right mind would do that. But there's enough, by far enough genetic difference even between two people who are 100% background in one of these 6 categories, or even, if you're watching this and you're not European, same thing applies. You look into your own ancestral roots, your own pre-monotheistic tribal roots, indigenous people's roots, and you find someone with that similar background, and you're going to have offspring that is extremely similar to you in their appearance, their psychological makeup, and you can be fairly certain also that there's a lot of health benefits for them in terms of worst case scenario, they have to find a bone marrow donor, for instance. They're going to have a much easier time finding a match. We could get into a lot of that health aspect, which I'll reserve for another video, but that's something you don't hear much about, that the more divergent and sort of complex your background is, the more difficult it is for you to find things like bone marrow donors that are a really close match. But that's just something to consider if you're drawn to that idea. And it's not to look down on people that choose to do things differently. This is just talking about this openly and with the intent of seeing if you resonate with it and want to sort of hone and take control of your future progeny. In that sense, it is what we already do naturally when we choose a partner. We look for traits that we desire to associate with and to pass on. Well, you can take it to another level when you bring in this information into your awareness. We could take this further and start talking about personality traits that are associated with these groups. But, you don't want to pigeonhole yourself. If you're interested in this, you can always look into that. It's also less proven, obviously, but these are kind of like associated traits which can be just simply developed through culture. What's the degree that is genetic versus environmental? But there's some credence to it when you consider things like the idea of pathological altruism, which was, Europeans, at least a large portion of them, lived through the last ice age in Europe. And to get along and to survive, those who survived actually were the most cooperative. So you had traits that were selected for being highly trusting of other people, and that led to success at that point in time. And there's even theories that the modern economic powerhouses of Europe and North America has origins in that as well, because people are more willing to work together without being family. Whereas you look at economies in places like the Middle East, you have a lot of oligarchical power. Not saying that doesn't exist in Europe. It certainly exists in Europe and North America as well. But you have stronger oligarchical power in those areas because people are less likely to work with people outside of the family when they're building an empire or a business or whatever it is that's occurring. But on the flip side, this could have its downfall. As you see, Europeans in recent news are being very allowing of people coming into their country, yet the people coming in don't have those same cultural values, perhaps even on a genetic level. So even if they did integrate, which doesn't happen when it happens en masse like this, you're going to have peoples that want to push the Europeans out. So this is going to have to be a turning point in European history, I believe, if people want to actually survive in terms of a unique genetic culture, and there'll have to be some decisions made. Or there's going to be some die-off of the people who are the most pathologically altruistic, and survival of the fittest in the modern world is going to select for those Europeans that actually decide to grow their balls back or to actually fully embody their balls in that sense. That's getting into the political side of the things I've been talking about in this channel lately. But identifying with those 6 groups, you can learn more about yourself, see which ones you come from. Maybe you're exclusively one group to a large extent. Maybe you're a bit of several. And there's no superiority or inferiority implied with those groups. It's just about understanding yourself and learning about yourself and your own history, and gleaning from that what you will. So let me know what you think about this video in the comments below. Check out any links I mentioned in the drop-down menu. I forget if I did mention any. It'll be there if I did. And I'll talk to you again soon. Take care.